So as Bill mentioned, I'm Pat Connolly, and I work at Condé Nast, and I'm here with Kristen, and we're here to talk a little bit about some of the different programs that we've done together. And I had the opportunity to show up yesterday and take in some of the masterclass content and some of the different things that people were sharing in terms of case studies. And I think those are incredibly valuable as examples of the type of work that's being done between publishers, agencies, and clients. And I think that what we wanted to focus on for our part of this conversation was less about sort of active case studies and really a little bit more about what we've learned and exactly what we've had the opportunity to really work together on and with each other as well as our other partners, and really think a little bit more about how the types of things that we've done have really sort of transformed our relationships and the relationships of our other partners. And so where did we want to start with this? So I think that everyone has really heard a little bit already about kind of the different types of experiences that are driving today's sort of content-driven marketplace. And I know that the keynote yesterday really focused on kind of this transformational marketplace and how content experiences are really driving consumption of audiences against brands. And I think that there's sort of an interesting data point from a company called the Affluent Collaborative. And what they recently revealed, I think this came out about last year sometime, was that over 70% of people that they surveyed wanted more in their life of things like travel, learning, entertainment, other types of experiences. And so you can see what they're really seeking out from their peers, from other brands, are these types of experiences and content that really fulfills them as an individual. And it's kind of this shift towards what Mary Meeker would call an asset-light lifestyle, which is people are seeking less in terms of tangible products and more about different types of content and experiences. And in that same survey, only 10% of the people that were surveyed said that they actually wanted more shopping or more products. So if you think about what that means for a brand marketer, for someone who ultimately, at the end of the day is trying to sell products, it means that they really need to transform their approach to marketing and advertising to really align with what the expectations of this new consumer landscape is. So if we could forward the slide. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is how what's critical to content is slides that work. Okay, so I think what's interesting is to kind of revisit really the most sort of fundamental core principle of advertising and marketing is this idea that brands are trying to connect with audiences, and they're trying to connect with audiences and turn those audiences into consumers. So if you think about the sort of basic tenets and principles of marketing and advertising, this is really what we've done for the last 100 years. And I think what agencies and publishers have traditionally done is they've acted as a proxy for that relationship. So publishers, what we do in the media landscape is we take content and we use that content to aggregate audiences and make those audiences approachable for advertisers. And agencies historically have sort of played on the other side of that, which is to come up with what's the right creative message that's really going to resonate with an audience on behalf of a brand. Let's find the right publisher that has the right audience and put the right message in the right place. It's a very sort of understood traditional dynamic. It's worked well for 100 years. And that's really kind of the core notion of brand building. I think what's interesting about today is that brands now have opportunities to now connect directly with these audiences in a way that they've never really had before. So whether it's social marketing through Twitter and Facebook, or whether it's retail outlets, whether it's an e-commerce outlet or in a new retail outlet that a brand has built to really engage people in a bigger experience, or whether it's data-driven marketing through database advertising, email advertising, or programmatic advertising, there are countless new ways that brands have to connect directly with these audiences, which is a huge opportunity if you're a client like L'Oreal. So what I think that's really interesting is this sort of paradigm shift now, where brands now have a new opportunity and new ways to work with publishers and agencies in a more strategic partnership way. So, again, historically, these publishers have always aggregated these audiences in a way that an advertiser or a client can approach them. But now beyond that, there's a new need and a new model and a new opportunity for brands to work more directly with those publishers and those media companies to understand, okay, we have these direct relationships now. We have this opportunity to build deeper relationships with these audiences, but how do we do that? We've always been in the business of creating advertising campaigns that have a start and an end date. And I think, we were talking on stage earlier about this example, but, at Condé Nast, we have a number of different publications that we push out, whether it's video or digital or print. And even if we got to a point where there was not a single ad running in Wired, or there was not a single ad running on glamour.com, you still have to create that content. You still have to push that content out because you have an audience that expects it to be there. And the minute you decide it no longer runs, and the minute you decide, oh, our campaign has ended and I'm not going to run this content anymore, the minute you've gotten to the point where you've let your audience down. And I think it really requires a different type of sensibility and a different type of approach to be successful at this notion of relationship building. And so a lot of what we want to talk about is really sort of what we've learned about these new paradigm shifts and these new types of relationships. Because while it's sort of easy to put on a chart with sliding circles to make it look incredibly strategic and brilliant, it's really much more difficult to actually execute because it really requires different structures and different relationships and really sort of how you're defining content in the first place. And so I think L'Oreal is a great example of the type of work that they've done both with us and with other partners in terms of how they're really rethinking a lot of these relationships.
Great. So with all this change, Pat and I are going to tackle what we consider to be 3 critical questions when you're defining and redefining your existing relationships and even for the future. So first is really how to define content and why that's so important, how to structure it, and lastly, how to succeed. And hopefully at the time we'll have some questions and be able to hear a little bit more from you. Okay. So to get started, defining content is obviously critical to its success. And so what I'm seeing now is that content is really becoming a catch-all and that it is pretty poorly defined, and it really depends. The answer that you get, I think, really depends on where the person sits within the ecosystem. If you talk to somebody at our ad agency, they may have a very different definition. And oftentimes I'm greeted with, oh, what do you do? And when I tell them what I do at L'Oréal Paris, one thing is content, and people are always whispering, so what exactly does that mean? Which I think is a great point. It means so much to so many different people. And I think what's critically important is defining content for your organization where it is today, because I think we all recognize that as technology grows and your organization grows with what content becomes in the future, it's going to become more and more expansive, and it's just really important to define it where you are today. So Pat, from where you sit, how do you define content, and are advertising and brand content the same thing?
So I've only been at Condé Nast for about 2 years. And before that, I spent most of my career at ad agencies, formerly working with the brilliant Dana Shank, who you'll hear from later today on the craft business. And I think that, for a long time working on the ad agency side of the business, what we were charged with was really taking kind of a strategic perspective on whatever we were asked to solve for by the client. So whether it was digital advertising or whether it was social advertising or whether it was content marketing, we always had a very sort of strategic, creative-driven approach to that. And I think that's always worked. I mean, that's really why agencies exist. And I think that we had a content marketing practice at the agency that I was at, and it was as viable as any other content marketing practice that exists out there. And I think that when I joined a publishing company about 2 years ago, I think it took that for me to really realize the distinction in what content is and why it's different from basically just putting together a Venn diagram with a couple of different buckets here and there that says, okay, here's our sort of agile content strategy. It's more than charts. It's more than a strategy. It's sort of a way of life, and it's almost a philosophy. And I think that when I joined Condé Nast, you really start to realize sort of how hard it is to achieve that sort of overused phrase of brand as publisher. There's a sort of a great line from sort of one of my favorite movies, which is A League of Their Own. And Dottie, who's the famous catcher who played, she was kind of the star of the team, is driving away from the ballpark, and she gets a phone call from Jimmy Dugan, the great coach, and she's decided to give up on baseball because, quote, it's too hard. It's too hard. It's not worth it. I don't need it. And Jimmy Dugan's response, brilliantly, is, of course it's hard. If it wasn't hard, everybody would do it. The hard is what makes it great. And I think that, what's interesting about that quote is I think that applies to content marketing in so many ways, because everyone is trying to do it, and it is very hard. And it's harder than I think a lot of people think, because the notion of brand as publisher and that idea and that phrase that's really widely used, and it's really just sort of put out there as a thing of, oh, if we hire enough staff writers and if we, quote, think like a publisher, then we can do this, and it's really not that hard. It requires a huge philosophical shift. And I think one of the things that's interesting about working for a publishing company, and I think one of the things that really can be meaningful to a brand or an agency or another media company, is the fact that there almost has to be a tension. You know, I'm sure people have always heard about sort of the church and state line between editors and publishers at a media company. And I think that, you know, what you really want is a tension that exists between the editor, who's really responsible to the audience, and the publisher, who's responsible to the brand. Without that tension, you're either going to create something that's way too focused on a brand and a product that's really not at all going to be interesting to an audience, or something that's just created for the audience and it really doesn't resonate at all with the products and the brands you're trying to promote. So I think you have to maintain that almost, you know, that level of sort of uncomfortability that really drives really great content marketing. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that I've learned going to a media company. I think it's important in terms of how you define content, because the way we define content at a publishing company has always been something that's created for the audience, not for the brand. And I think that distinction, which is easy to say but incredibly difficult to execute on, is really important about the way people define marketing, or define content. Mm-hmm. Which also sort of leads to kind of how we've structured ourselves. So, you know, Condé, as kind of a company that has a 100-year-old legacy of creating great content, you know, is really all about now how we work with partners and how we sort of structure ourselves for success working directly with clients. And so we've really had to set ourselves up to not just be great content creators for a brand like Wired or Glamour, but also to be able to work directly with our partners like L'Oreal. And so we've really had to structure ourselves up almost like a services entity, like an agency within Condé Nast to work with L'Oreal. So I think it's also interesting to understand more about how a brand like L'Oreal has set themselves up to be successful.
Yeah, so I would say this year, our content production has more than doubled, and the real reason for this is because we relaunched our digital platform at the beginning of the year, and we needed, it's a personalized engine, and basically every time you come to our site, it gets to know you better and better, and so we needed content to be able to feed to consumers, which it's a vast amount of content, as you can imagine. So I think for us, it's a lot of learning as we go. And I think in a CPD organization, content isn't really at the core of what we do. So it's not only about content creation, it's also about setting up a completely new business model. So this year has been a pretty fascinating year in terms of that. And I think, you know, what my advice would be, or what we've learned, I think, you know, a couple of things. One, you know, you can have a content calendar, which I think a lot of people may have, but what you really need is a content strategy. You really need to be able to figure out where you're going and who you're going to do this with. I think, you know, yesterday you saw a lot about, you know, how to map it out on a chart, and I think that is a key step along the way. But I think the other piece that often people don't talk about are the personalities and the politics that are involved with that chart, which is definitely something that I think everyone will struggle with, because I think as people see where the future of content is really going and the size of the prize that holds, I think everyone's looking to carve out their piece. So I think a couple, you know, beyond the strategy and laying out, you know, who's doing what, which is so important, I think the other piece that we've realized along the way is how to sell in and evangelize what you're doing. I think content is never the thing that at Monday at 9 a.m. when, you know, your business is having an issue or not, that somebody wants to see you about. So I think you always have to sort of fight to make sure that people understand what you're doing and why it's important. And that'll also lead to, you know, another a lesson that I had this year was how much time content creation really takes. So there's the strategy piece, but obviously the content creation itself takes an inordinate amount of time. And I think I probably underestimated the amount of time it would have taken for my team and just the burden that has. And I think that's really important to get your organization on board in terms of, you know, headcount and also agencies and how much it takes to get this done. And lastly, it's really about distribution. So I think we're at a point where we have a ton of content and we're distributing it on our own channels as well as through paid media, but I think it's also important to make sure that your management understands the role of paid distribution along the way, because I think there's a lot of notion, and I'm sure many of you have been challenged with, I need someone to create a viral video for me. So I think, I think a lot of people don't really understand that just doesn't happen. You know, there's very few things that happen like that naturally, that as a CPD company we would create. But I think, having people and management understand what that takes. I mean, for us in our world, when you look at Dove, the Sketches campaign, I'm not sure a lot of people really understand in our organization that really was driven primarily by paid. And so I think you have to not only have, the budgets and the structure to create the content, but it's critically important that people are actually seeing all of this content. So that kind of leads us into the next. So if we have, a great strategy, you've built like your internal evangelists along the way, and you have distribution, how do you know if all of this is really working? And I think one of the things sort of working against us in all of this is how the dollars are allocated or labeled in content. And oftentimes, there's a phrase, non-working media, which off the bat, that phrase suggests that this, content isn't working, or that it has to be defined by traditional measures. So I think that's definitely a battle that we have to fight, for sure. So Pat, in your organization, how do you know, like, how is something working, and how do you talk about metrics?
So I think that, to your point about non-working media, I think that there tends to be a desire to put things like content marketing in existing boxes to help understand how to measure it and how it's effective. And so whether it's GRPs, which is really more of kind of a reach-based, TV-based model, or whether it's click-through rates, which is more of kind of a dated way to measure digital advertising, I think the way a lot of brands, unfortunately, and even media companies are approaching this, is to say, okay, well, there's this kind of new landscape of content marketing, and we need to understand whether it's working or not. So let's apply our very sort of traditional measurement to that to determine whether it's working or not. And I think there's a huge danger in that. I think, to go back to what we had talked about at the beginning of this presentation around how one of the things that's allowing for these new sort of dynamic relationships between agencies, publishers, and clients is the fact that that this is really more about relationship building than it is about reach-based planning. And I think that, when people tend to measure these types of things by GRPs or by click-through rates or even sometimes by engagement levels, it's very sort of traditional KPIs that they're trying to cram this sort of new landscape into. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. So I think, the way that we've looked at this is really about establishing what the purpose of content is in the first place. And so this really goes back to kind of our first point, which is when you define content, part of defining content is not only, what do you expect it to do for you and how do you expect it to resonate with your audiences, but really, what is the purpose of it? Why are you doing it? Why are you using it? Is it really just because it's a better version of advertising, or is it actually meant to do something else that is really meant to have a longer term type of relationship building approach to it? And I think, the first thing that you need to do is establish what it is that you expect content to do. And when you do that, then you should have KPIs that ultimately map back to that. So it shouldn't be about GRPs unless you're really expecting content to be a reach play, to go back to your viral video example. So I think for us at Condé Nast, a lot of what we've done is we've started to apply the types of KPIs that we use on the media side, on the publishing side, to our brand partners. And so, we have a handful of different metrics that we use to determine how successful, Vogue.com is or VanityFair.com is in terms of driving loyalty and engaging their audiences. And that's things like repeat visitation. That's things like lag time or time spent on the site. That's things like, how much are they sharing content from the site? How often are they ultimately churning through the site? In other words, do they come to visit one page, or do they ultimately come and read a lot of different pieces of content and then share that type of content? So that's a very different type of engagement measure than something like click-through rate or GRPs. And I think for us, that obviously nets out into what our ultimate financial model is, which is monetization of a site. We want people to share content. We want people to come back to our domains so we can monetize that inventory. So there's a clear financial connection to the way that we've created these KPIs, which is ultimately how we start to understand, is the content that we're creating driving the type of behavior that we want. So I think it's really incredibly important to say, okay, if we're going to do content marketing, as opposed to it being sort of a big cliche buzzword, let's really understand what we want it to do and what we expect it to do. And then let's start to create key performance indicators and metrics that go along with whatever we ultimately want it to do. And then we start to measure it and optimize it over time. And again, I think it's important to recognize that if you really want to be good at this, It's really not about having a campaign that goes out and then ends and then you wait 6 months before you do something new. You should be iterating. You should be learning about what did work and what didn't work and starting to optimize against that. And I think that, that truthfully is what we do as a media company, and that's what most media companies do, is they understand what type of content really resonates with their audience, and then they create more of it. And so I think, philosophically, there is something to this notion of behave and think like a publisher, but I think it's pretty complex when you get down to it. And I think there's a lot of value in starting to understand the type of success metrics that you might want to apply to a program that might be sort of non-traditional that really set you up for more success.
Great. So we just wanted to leave you today with really 3 key takeaways, and I think the big important one being, having the conversation about what content is. I think if you start to have that conversation within your organization, you'll find that a lot of different people have a lot of different answers to that. And also, making sure that you define the roles with your partners, your agency partners, and with your external partners, because I think the truth is that everyone has a seat at the table. You just have to define what that is so that you're not wasting a lot of efforts, and that you have somebody, whoever that is in your organization, is controlling the tone and sort of the volume of the work that's being done.
So the second is really about structure, and I think this goes a lot back to that notion of a healthy tension. I really firmly, fundamentally believe that if you're doing this and you don't feel a healthy tension as a brand or as a publisher about, are you creating something for an audience or are you creating something for a brand, then you're doing something wrong. It's not easy. It's incredibly difficult. We're really at the beginning of a huge shift in the marketplace, which really represents tons of opportunity for all of us. But I think, it's sort of up to us to really define what that is and what that looks like. And at the end of the day, it's sort of, consulting your sort of inner consumer or your inner audience, which is really understanding, is what we're creating interesting? Is it really going to resonate with me as a person? Do I want to read this? Do I think this is more valuable than getting content elsewhere? And so I think at the end of the day, it's about structuring yourself to really be able to deliver on that consumer and audience need. Because if you're not doing that, then you're basically just creating, an ad and calling it content.
Yeah, and I think from the brand perspective, we often, times deal with the publishing side, but really never the editorial side from buying media. And I think thinking like a publisher is going to require us to start talking to, learning, educating ourselves about what does that really mean? What does that really mean to take all of this on and thinking that way? And then lastly is really define what working means before you start. You don't want to leave this up for interpretation, obviously. And I think, my goal really is to start to change the word non-working to working, and however that works within your organization.
So again, we really wanted to focus on kind of like what we've learned, again, through our partnerships and through our partnerships with other clients and partners and things like that. And so we also wanted to open up to questions from anybody in the room, be it from the brand side or the publisher side.
Okay, so I'm going to prime the pump. I'll get the first question. So I totally agree with you about not force-fitting traditional metrics, but can you give us an example of a project that you worked on? What metrics did you put in place, and what was your performance against that?
So I think, we've done a few projects where, the metrics were not things like click-through rate. So, as an example, we've done work with clients where the metrics are really more based on how behavior with their content ultimately is a proxy for some sort of purchase behavior, but it's really looked at over the longer term. So as an example, if you're able to work with a third-party e-commerce vendor, as an example, or anybody that can ultimately measure lift in sales in the marketplace, and then you're able to map those back to sort of behaviors that people exhibit with your content, whether it's shared, whether it's downloaded, whether it's looked at more than once, then ultimately those types of things start to become a proxy for actually shifts in the marketplace in terms of like what matters most to a company, which is ultimately sales off the shelf, right? So I think, in that type of an instance, it was backing out. I mean, the reality is, and everybody knows this, if it doesn't move product at some point, it's useless, right? I mean, the point of this is, even if it's upper funnel brand advertising that is really meant to, at some point on down the road, shift perception and shift behavior, then there's really no point to it if it doesn't sell product at some point, right? So I think that, for us, with a lot of the content work that we've done, it's really about understanding if you back out from the very lower funnel metrics of sales and you start to get different behaviors that lead up to content, then really what you can start to do is you can start to create content that drives that type of behavior, but on down the road ultimately has an impact on sales.
You mentioned the Dove campaign, and obviously it's been very successful with the sketch artists. There's like 55 million views, and the ecosystem itself, a couple 100 million. So when you mentioned seeding, how much of that was actually seeded to get the snowball rolling, and the rest of it became organic?
I think I don't know, I'm not have all the information not being from Dove, but I do believe like very little of it was I think they did a little bit of seeding, but then I think the majority of that really was from paid, at least as far as what I've been told from other partners.
Which, by the way, I think there's nothing wrong with, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, you know, as a media company, we have an entire consumer marketing division, as does most other media companies. And the goal of the consumer marketing division is to get new audiences for your content, right? So I think, you know, I think sometimes there's this notion of, well, if it's really great content, we can just build it and people will find it.
Yeah.
And unless it's the Jimmy Kimmel twerking video from YouTube that happened over the last few days, it's not really going to happen. But I think, you know, that's what media companies do. That's what we do. We try and promote content so people discover it, and then it reaches kind of a tipping point where it takes on a life of its own.
I wasn't judging. I was impressed.
Yeah, I just think that
Understood.
most people, you know, especially in the management level, depending on where you are, don't realize that, you know, creating a viral video, that doesn't really exist, you know, especially on a brand side. Yes, and, you know, there are lots of crazy things that happen in the world that go viral, but I just think it's really important that people understand that half of your budget, you know, you have set aside money for content creation, but equally as important is setting aside ample money to distribute that content.
Kristen, beauty marketing is a specialized discipline. What specifically, from a beauty perspective, is different when you do content than maybe some other categories?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very fortunate to sit, you know, and work on a brand, beauty, where people want to consume that content. So I think that's also really important, depending on, you know, what brands you represent, to figure out what does that mean for you. I think there are just some categories that are going to be more consumable than others, and figuring out, you know, what's your tone and sort of what are the boundaries that you have to work in. But I think beauty, obviously, you know, we've seen a lot of the success, you know, on our YouTube channel with Destination Beauty, with our bloggers and bloggers, that it's something that is a lot easier than perhaps some other categories. And I think you just have to find that right balance in your tone. And that's why I think it's really important also to define what that is, you know, with the people that are playing those roles as well.
I think, just to build on that, I think, you know, one of the most interesting examples of content marketing that I think exists out there is at L'Oreal. And there's a woman named Michelle Phan who's a video creator, and she has a huge audience in the beauty space around a lot of how-to videos and things like that. And she existed sort of in her own right, and she's built her own audiences. And, you know, so L'Oreal took a very unique perspective on this content. Instead of going to Michelle Phan and just saying, hey, can we integrate a bunch of our products into your existing videos, they worked with her to actually create a new line of beauty products. And to me, that's about really understanding how people react to personalities and content, and creating a brand around content where the product is a manifestation of the content and not the inverse.
Okay, if you could comment on one more thing, which is what separates people that are really good at this from people that are struggling with it?
I mean, I think, you know, a lot of it is how are you defining content? And I just came from an internal offsite on content, and we were asked to sort of say, pick, you know, your favorite piece of content. And it was actually, when I was trying to do the exercise, it was very difficult, because the things that were popping up for me were sort of like the usual players, like the Apple, the Nikes of the world. And I think the real challenge, you know, for somebody like that sits at L'Oreal, where product advertising is really at the core of what we do. We launch products, we expect them to sell. We don't really have the breathing room for really brand campaigns. Is how can a product advertising, a company, a CPD company, really do outstanding content in that forum? And I think that's sort of the challenge is, you know, outside of like a big vision campaign, how does that really break through?
I think, you know, a lot of it comes down to understanding, you know, who your new competition is if you're a content marketer. And I think that, you know, I've worked with a lot of different clients who are really sort of under the misapprehension that, well, okay, so we're in this content marketing business, so we're gonna build a bunch of content, we're gonna put it in a bunch of ads, and we've sort of checked the box, and now we're huge content marketers because they have a CMS. And, you know, content marketing is not about a CMS. A CMS is a platform to enable content marketing. But I think, you know, one of the huge things that brands really need to think about in the content marketing space is if you're going to really compete in this space, you have to be able to command the attention of people beyond all of the other content out there. And as a publishing and media company, believe me when I say that there is shitloads of stuff out there to compete with. And so I think you have to be able to create a point of view. You have to be able to distinguish your content and really have a reason to exist. So if you're L'Oreal and you're creating content, you either need to have a different point of view than Glamour and Allure, or you need to be louder and bigger than Glamour and Allure. And in either of those instances, that's a very challenging thing to do. So I think that the most successful content marketers have started to realize that their competitive landscape is not only the traditional brands that they've competed with, but now every content creator that exists out there. And as more and more people delve into this space, the challenge is really going to be able to say, I, as a brand, have a reason to create content in this space, and I have an audience that's willing to come to me because I'm creating something valuable to them, not just being able to create something that ultimately you put out there and check a box. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.